Welcome to everyone. It's a great pleasure this afternoon to have Professor George Demacopoulos from Fordham University, who is going to speak on Orthodox text, which is of great problematic character for Jewish-Christian relations. And George has specialized, done a lot of work in this area of liturgical texts. And so we much look forward to hearing him. He is the John Meyendorff, famous name, and Patterson Family Professor of Orthodox Studies at Fordham University. And he's author of several books, including a wonderful one called The Invention of Peter, Apostolic Discourse and Papal Authority in Late Antiquity. So dealing with another controversial subject. So George, we hand over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sebastian and Thea, for the kind invitation. I'm really flattered to be here. It's such a big audience of some very prestigious scholars, and I'd like to say from the beginning that I am a complete interloper, not only to the study of hymns, but especially to academic work regarding regarding Jewish-Christian relations. I'm involved in my own university and attend many events and things like that, but I've never done anything quite like this. And frankly, I stumbled upon it really by accident. I've just completed a book that will be published by Dumbarton Oaks in the spring. The title of the book is Sacralizing Violence in Byzantium: Hymns, Empire, and the Narrowing of Christian Identity. And in just a sentence or two, it's a study of the way that hymns that were composed in Greek between the 5th and the 10th century treat themes of violence, and especially how that changed dramatically in the 7th century. So when I was doing that research, I worked, of course, with the Jerusalem Georgian chant book. I don't read Georgian, so I was relying on Stephen Shoemaker's translations. And I wanted to have a section on the oldest surviving Good Friday hymns. So the oldest hymns that Shoemaker translated from the Georgian chant book, you'll hear about it a little bit, but they all come from Jerusalem. Probably 5th, 6th century, and they are all about the death and resurrection of Jesus. There's 1,000 of them, and it's all about that. And so then I wanted to transition to looking at hymns that were composed exclusively for Good Friday, and the oldest surviving ones. And it was precisely there that I saw such a profound shift in the way that Jews were treated in the description of the crucifixion. You have 1,000 hymns from the 5th and 6th century that do it one way, and then all of a sudden you have these new hymns composed just for Good Friday that do it a different way. So that is what my paper is about today. Okay? All right. So the oldest surviving Christian hymns designed exclusively for Holy Week are a set known as the Idiomele. They were composed by monks, possibly Miaphysite monks, in Palestine during the middle of the 6th century in the reign of the Roman Emperor Justinian. In the modern Orthodox Church, these 12 hymns are sung during the Royal Hour service of Good Friday morning. The final and most famous of these 12 hymns is sung during 2 additional services, on Holy Thursday evening and on Friday afternoon. Apart from their antiquity, the most noteworthy feature of these hymns is that they were the first to blame the Jews for the death of Christ. My goal in this paper for you this afternoon is fourfold. First, I will demonstrate that the presentation of the Jews in the Idiomele constituted a dramatic change from earlier hymns that reflected on the crucifixion of Christ. Second, I will argue that this change represents more than a mere rhetorical or apologetical shift, but constitutes a genuine theological shift with respect to the meaning of Christ's death. Third, I will demonstrate that this change was precipitated by an explosion of Jewish Christian violence at the time of composition, and that these hymns likely reflect a form of anti-Jewish revenge literature. And finally, I will suggest that the Idiomele have been unwittingly preserved down to the present day by a series of individuals and institutions that presumably knew nothing of the origins of their composition and who have been either incapable or unwilling to address their theological incoherence. So, part one, a reversal of previous hymnography. The Idiomele may be the oldest Holy Week hymns, but they were not the first hymns to reflect on the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Approximately 1,000 hymns emphasizing those very themes predate the Idiomele by at least 100 years. Those earlier hymns also originate from Palestine, specifically from the Church of the Anastasis in Jerusalem, and they were part of an 8-week cycle of hymns for the Vesper, Matins, and liturgy services of Sundays. This was the oldest form of an octoikos, an 8-week cycle. These hymns were composed in Greek, but they only survive in an ancient Georgian translation contained within a text known as the Jerusalem Georgian Chant Book. The hymns of the chant book are the oldest Christian hymns in existence, and they provide unparalleled access to the theological vision of the earliest Christian communities. While a few of the hymns in the chant book contain negative statements about the Jews, none of them suggest that the Jews were responsible for the death of Christ. On the contrary, those hymns consistently position the whole of humanity as responsible for the death of Christ. This is because the theological positioning of the hymns is such that Christ's death and resurrection are proclaimed to save the whole of humanity from death. But grammatically, the hymns of the chant book actually position the singers as those most responsible for the death of Christ. They are the ones singing of Christ's death. They are the ones lamenting what they themselves have done. To put it more succinctly, our oldest evidence of Christian hymnography informs us that week after week, Christians sang of themselves as the ones most responsible for the death of Christ. It is both historically and theologically significant that these early Christians in Jerusalem did not assign blame for the death of Jesus beyond their own community. But that is precisely what began to happen with the composition of the Idiomele during the reign of the Roman Emperor Justinian. 4 of the 12 hymns explicitly name the Jews as the lone group responsible for Jesus' crucifixion. These statements are contained in the 4th, 6th, 7th, and 8th hymns, respectively, if you're using the Greek manuscripts rather than the Georgian ones. A 5th hymn speaks indirectly of the Jews by juxtaposing the transgressors to the Gentiles. In this particular hymn, the Gentiles are allied with the singers, in other words, the Christians, because they are the ones who, quote, glorify Christ with the Father and Spirit. Thus, nearly half of the Idiomele develop their exegetical and theological points about the crucifixion by blaming the Jews for Jesus' violent death. For example, in the sixth Idiomele, Christ rhetorically asks the Jews which of the many miraculous things that he did for them was the cause of the crucifixion. And so this is the first hymn that I've provided on the handout. So this is Christ now speaking in the hymn. When you were led to the crucifixion, you cried, O Lord, for what deed do you seek to crucify me, O you Jews? Is it because I made your paralyzed walk? Because I raised the dead as though from sleep? I healed her who had the issue of blood and took pity on the woman of Cana. For what deed do you seek to kill me, O you Jews? But, O transgressors, you shall look upon Christ, whom you now pierce. Whereas the biblical texts that describe the crucifixion provide only meager insight into Christ's emotional or psychological state throughout the Passion, for example, his request to the Father that he might let this cup pass, this hymn adds considerable emotional weight to the scene. The hymnographer goes well beyond a description of the physical pain of crucifixion to dramatize and thereby maximize the emotional toll that Christ suffers by having been betrayed by the very people he came to save. The same pattern continues in the next Idiomelon, the seventh, which contains a fresh set of juxtapositions. It concludes with Christ's decision to extend the benefits of his sacrifice, a sacrifice initially meant for the Jews, but now offered to the Gentiles. And so this is the second hymn on the handout. Thus says the Lord to the Jews, O my people, what have I done unto you? Or wherein have I wearied you? I gave light to the blind and cleansed your lepers. I raised up the man who lay upon his bed. O my people, what have I done unto you, and how have you repaid me? Instead of manna, you have given me gall. Instead of water, vinegar. Instead of loving me, you have nailed me to the cross. I can endure no more. I shall call my Gentiles, and they shall honor me with the Father in spirit, and I shall bestow on them eternal life. The Christian affirmation of Christ's divinity is on full display in the dialogue that takes place from the cross. Christ declares that it is he, in other words, God, who offered manna, but he is repaid with gall. It is he who offers love, but he is repaid with the violence of the cross. Because the community sings from the perspective of Christ, the emotional toll of rejection is not something that the community observes from a distance. Rather, the suffering that they enunciate is a suffering that they voice as their own. Christ's pain is their pain. Christ's sense of betrayal becomes their own. The betrayal is not just a betrayal of Christ. Through the performance of the hymn, the betrayal of Christ becomes a betrayal of the Christian singer as well. The whole of the Christian community enunciates the pain of betrayal as though it is their own. Taken together, the list of miracles in the sixth and seventh hymns not only serve to reinforce the Christian belief in Jesus' divinity, but they especially call attention to the failure of the Jews to acknowledge Christ's efforts on their behalf. The explicit naming of the Jews suggests that culpability for Christ's suffering belongs exclusively to them. The implicit we of the more ancient hymns has been replaced by the accusation that it is that it is the Jews alone who have put Christ to death. In effect, the point of reflection has changed. Rather than see the crucifixion as an ontological event that alters the relationship between God and humanity, 5 of these 12 idiomela turn the crucifixion into a narrowly focused historical narrative in which Christ is murdered by a specific group of outsiders whose descendants remain culpable for his death. By speaking of the Jews and the Jews alone as the transgressors responsible for Christ's death, the authors of the Idiomele erase key historical aspects of the Gospel's account of Christ's passion. I suggest that this erasure reflects a profound transformation in late ancient Christian identity vis-a-vis Rome. Indeed, it is noteworthy that this set of hymns makes no mention of the role of the Romans in the crucifixion, even though crucifixion was primarily a Roman form of punishment. The Idiomele offer no reference to Pilate, to Pilate's wife, or to the Roman soldiers who put Christ to death. Is this because Christian identity among Palestinian Christians has evolved to such a degree that the authors of the Idiomele now so fully view themselves as Romans that they deliberately ignore Roman culpability in the violence that Christ suffers? Perhaps more importantly, we might ask why the authors of the Idiomele speak of the Jews as though they are some foreign external community, when, of course, Jesus, his disciples, and the vast majority of his earliest followers were not only Jews by birth, but by observance. In short, why do these hymns transform the assignment of guilt for Christ's death from the we that we see in the octoikos to a they, the Jews? This transferal of Christian identity away from its Jewish origins and toward the Romans is even more pronounced in the 11th hymn. This is number 3 on your handout. When the transgressors nailed you, O Lord of glory, to the cross, you cried aloud to them, how have I grieved you? Or where have I angered you? Before me, who delivered you from tribulation? And how do you now repay me? You have given me evil for good. In return for the pillar of fire, you have nailed me to the cross. In return for the cloud, you have dug a grave for me. Instead of manna, you have given me gall. Instead of water, you have given me vinegar to drink. Henceforth, I will call the Gentiles, and they will glorify me with the Father and the Holy Spirit. Whereas this hymn does not name the Jews explicitly, the closing offer to invite the Gentiles provides a clear indication that the hymn is juxtaposing the singers who recognize God as Trinity from those non-singers who do not. Because the Jews do not recognize Christ as God, they are in theological error. But more pointedly, they are also guilty of his murder. And it is for this reason that the hymn explicitly connects the violence perpetrated by the Jews against Christ as the reason for Christ's embrace of the Gentiles. The Jews nail Christ to the cross. The Jews dig his grave. The Jews give him gall and vinegar. As a consequence, Christ calls the Gentiles, and they glorify him. In short, why do these hymns transform the assignment of guilt for Christ's death from the we that we see in the octoikos to a they, the Jews? What has changed, theologically or contextually, for Palestinian Christians between the composition of the hymns of the chant book and the composition of the Idiomele that might help us understand this profound transformation of the positional identity of the community of singers? So I'll transition now to part 2, what I call theological problems. To understand the theological significance of recalibrating who is responsible for the violence that Christ suffers, we can look to a comparison between those idiomele that do and those that do not isolate the Jews for censure. The second idiomelon affirms that Christ was nailed to the cross by wicked men for our sins. The third notes that Christ suffered the transgressors to lay hold of him. Hymns that use phrases like wicked men or transgressors to identify the culprits of Christ's crucifixion without any other indication of their identity are both more historically accurate, and more importantly, they are more amenable to a constructive exegesis of the crucifixion than those that transfer all of the guilt to an external body, such as the Jews. This is because a singer can see him or herself in the more generic description of sinners. As the ancient Sunday hymns affirm, Christ suffered on behalf of all because all humans have sinned and need the saving act of Christ's death and resurrection. But in shifting the focus of culpability for Christ's death from a collective group of singing sinners to a non-singing external community, in this case the Jews, these 5 idiomele forsake one of the most important theological dimensions of the Christian theology of the cross. That is, that Christ died because we needed him to do so. To be clear, not all of the idiomele make this theological mistake, and poetically, many of these hymns are quite beautiful. The final one, "Today is hung upon the cross he who suspended the earth and waters," is to my mind the most powerful hymn of Holy Week, and this is number 4 on your handout. Today, he who hung the earth upon the waters is hung upon a cross. He who is king of the angels is arrayed in a crown of thorns. He who wrapped the heaven in clouds is wrapped in the purple of mockery. He who in Jordan set Adam free receives blows upon his face. The bridegroom of the church is transfixed with nails. The son of the virgin is pierced with a spear. We venerate your passion, O Christ. Show us also your glorious resurrection. But there is little doubt that the 5 anti-Jewish idiomele introduce a new and theologically problematic account of the crucifixion. Why, we might ask, did the authors of the Idiomele abandon centuries of hymnographic tradition to assign blame for Christ's death outside of the community? This is part 3, what I call historical answers. When we attempt to answer these questions, we should not lose sight of the fact that Palestine possessed a sizable Jewish community even after the legalization of Christianity. Indeed, at the time of the Roman Emperor Constantine's accession, the Jewish community was both larger and stronger than that of the Christians in Palestine. Like other parts of the empire, Palestine did not become majority Christian until the early part of the 5th century. But even then, the number of Jews and Samaritans in Palestine remained significant. The continued presence of so many Jews in Palestine may have posed an existential threat to Christians. As Stephen Shoemaker once put it, if Jesus was truly the Jewish Messiah, and Christianity was, as it claimed, the completion of Judaism, why did so many Jews remain? Legally and financially speaking, the situation for Jews deteriorated after Constantine's legalization of Christianity. Since antiquity, the Romans had placed certain restrictions on Jews, but they had been exempted from imperial requirements for religious conformity. Constantine maintained the status quo of his pagan predecessors, but Constantine's successors enacted new laws that introduced strict boundaries between Jewish and Christian communities. In response to their declining status, some Jews and Samaritans undertook periods of armed resistance against the Romans of Palestine between the mid-4th and mid-5th century. It is noteworthy that those initial uprisings were followed by nearly a century of peace between the Council of Chalcedon in 451 to the accession of Justinian in the year 527. Noteworthy because this period of relative peace coincides with the likely dating of the production of the Octoekos, which shows far fewer signs of anti-Jewish rhetoric or disposition than our 12 Idiomele. But this relative peace between Jews and Christians in Palestine came to an end with the rise of Justinian. Justinian imposed vigorous anti-Jewish legislation that, among other things, recalibrated the legal definition of heresy to include anyone who was not Orthodox. This meant that the punishments for doctrinal nonconformity could now, under Justinian, be applied to non-Christians. For example, Justinian was the first emperor to prohibit Jews from serving as members of the curia, in other words, local town councils, which greatly diminished civic and financial opportunities for Jewish landowners. The emperor also expanded the penalties for Jews owning slaves and passed a new law that required Jews to release any slave who sought baptism, regardless of whether the motivation for conversion was genuine. Whereas those laws had placed financial hardships upon Jewish communities, Justinian's Novella 37 and Novella 131 imposed religious restrictions forbidding the construction of any new synagogues. The effort to frustrate Jewish worship went further still in the Palestinian town of Borion, where Justinian ordered the transformation of a local synagogue into a church and likely forced many of the Jews to convert to Christianity by the hands of the army. Given the amplification of anti-Jewish measures, it is not surprising that Justinian's reign witnessed the largest outbreak of anti-Christian violence by Jews of the entire late ancient period. The most dramatic of these uprisings occurred in the early 550s. The precise date appears differently in our sources. It may have occurred in 552, or else in 555 or 556. In this particular instance, a mob of Jews and Samaritans joined forces to assault the Christians of Caesarea, the coastal city and capital of the Roman province. In addition to killing a number of Christians, including the provincial governor, the mob plundered and burned a series of Christian churches in the region. Additional uprisings followed, which consistently pitted Palestinian Christians and Jews against one another well into the 7th century. In his redating of the Idiomele, Christopher Sweeney compellingly argued that these hymns were produced sometime between Justinian's first edict of the Theopaschite controversy in 533 and the transformation of the liturgical calendar in Jerusalem, which occurred in 560 CE. According to Sweeney, the hymns were either composed by Miaphysite monks in Gaza between 533 and 553 and adopted by the Chalcedonian monks at Marsaba after Justinian's Theopaschite legislation of 553, or the hymns were produced by the monks of Marsaba in the narrow time frame between 553 and 560. Either scenario lends itself to a Chalcedonian adoption of these hymns at precisely the point in history when Jewish and Christian communities in Palestine were undergoing unprecedented levels of conflict. And either scenario reflects the precise moment in Byzantine history when imperial legislation and rhetoric took its harshest anti-Jewish terms. In other words, the amplification of anti-Jewish rhetoric contained within the Idiomele is fully consistent with the on-the-ground realities of Jewish-Christian conflict at the time of their composition. In short, the ahistorical, anti-Jewish dimension of these hymns reflects a kind of revenge literature. So, part 4. The perpetuation of anti-Jewish rhetoric in other Holy Week hymns. It would be impossible to produce a complete history of the transmission of manuscripts from the original composition of the Idiomele in Palestine in the 550s to the printing of Ottoman-era texts that serve as the basis for the modern Orthodox Christian Holy Week service in a variety of languages. Nevertheless, I attempt here a very brief overview that explains the major changes to the Holy Week commemorations between the composition of the Idiomele in the 550s to the first printing of an English language translation of the Orthodox Holy Week book, which was done by the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese in the United States in the year 1963. It is generally well known that Jerusalem and Constantinople served as the two greatest incubators for hymnographic composition for the Greek-speaking Orthodox world during the Byzantine period. In the centuries after the initial composition of the Idiomele, Palestinian authors, especially those at the famous monastery of Marsaba, continued to compose new hymns for the commemoration of Christ's passion and resurrection. That composition underwent a profound technical change during the early 7th and 8th century with the transition to a different hymnographic genre known as the canon. We might note that this transition occurred after the Islamic conquest of Palestine, and it seems, at least to me, that the preference for the canon form, one that emphasized the internalizing and asceticizing of short biblical reference, was very much a response to changing fortunes of Christians in Palestine. But whatever the case may be, during the 9th century, the famous Constantinopolitan monastery of Studios imported and rearranged hundreds, probably thousands of hymns that had been in use in Palestine. The Studite monks created the first distinctive typikon for the Lenten period, using a combination of Jerusalem-based hymns, pre-existing Constantinopolitan hymns, and new hymns of Studite composition. This 9th century Lenten typikon, known as the Triodion, remains the basis for the services of Holy Week still performed throughout the Orthodox Christian world today. Between the 9th and 15th centuries, the monks of Studios continued to experiment with the composition of new hymns and the rearrangement of existing hymns in their Triodion. For example, it wasn't until the very end of this period that we find the first manuscripts that include some of the Ingopia or Lamentations, the famous hymns sung by Orthodox Christians on Holy Friday evening. That Friday evening service is the most attended service in the Orthodox Christian world, even more than Easter itself. We should bear in mind that the Studite typikon for services was just one of many in the Middle Ages. Most cathedral churches, whether in Constantinople or Antioch or Jerusalem, had their own distinctive typika, just as every major monastic house had its own typika. Scholars privileged the Studite one in their histories of Eastern Christian liturgy because it was the first to introduce the Lenten triodion, and because it came to have an outside influence on modern church services. In part, this is because the Latin occupation of Byzantium during the Fourth Crusade put a permanent end to the cathedral rite of Hagia Sophia, and in part, it is because the first Ottoman-era printings of liturgical texts were printings of services that were derivative of the Studite typikon, even though the Studite monastery did not exist at the time of those printings. It had been destroyed with the Ottoman occupation. We should not lose sight of the extraordinary power of the printing press to codify a singular liturgical form, effectively suppressing all others. Indeed, the current form of the Eastern Christian Holy Week services, including the specific hymns, were Ottoman-era arrangements of a Studite-inspired version of the Triodion, which happened to be the one mass-produced in the Greek language via print houses in Italy. All modern English translations, and for that matter, translations into most languages, are derivative of those 16th and 17th century Greek printings which occurred in Italy. Returning to my theme of anti-Jewish rhetoric in the Idiomele, I'll observe that in the 1100 years between the composition of the Idiomele and the last hymns to be composed in the Byzantine tradition, changing historical circumstances gave rise to new hymnographic forms and theological emphases. But one thing that did not change was the penchant for Byzantine and Ottoman era hymnographers to perpetuate and even expand anti-Jewish rhetoric in their accounts of Christ's passion. To my mind, this is a problem, not only because these hymns break from the theological tradition of the earliest church, but because they can be so easily shown to be an ahistorical, rhetorical reaction to temporary conditions that haven't existed for 1500 years. It may well be the case that the Middle Byzantine monks who incorporated the offending Idiomele into the Triodion and crafted new hymns inspired by them knew nothing of their historic origins and simply presumed that they were theologically sound because they had been employed by a previous generation. The same is true of the Ottoman era Orthodox who printed the texts and the 20th century translators of those texts. But we do not have the luxury of that same ignorance. It is time for Eastern Christians to expunge hymns from our Good Friday commemorations when those hymns fail to capture theological significance of the event they are trying to commemorate. Thank you.
Thank you, George. That was most interesting and very, very helpful, very clear. And you highlight at the end the real problem that I think Eastern Christianity has and Western Christianity has with some of its hymnography. But you set out the history of this so nicely and neatly and far more clearly than I had in my mind before. And I'm sure you're right that it is historical events in Palestine in the 6th century that are really behind this emergence of very unpleasant revenge hymnography. But it's good that the Georgian material is just at the right time emerging, thanks to scholars, Georgian scholars, and a wonderful Father Athanasius Renou, who's translated a lot of the into French, these hymns, and Stephen Shoemaker has done a translation too of many of them. So we're open to questions, and I'm sure there will be many questions. So either put your hand up, and I hope that'll appear on the screen somewhere, or do pose questions through chat. And
Yes, Marie.
last time has run out, and we must stop. Thank you enormously, George. This was a most enlightening paper, and we look forward to reading your book, which will no doubt be a very important stimulant to maybe some sort of change. One always hopes for the future in the content of hymnography. But we must end today, and our next meeting is on the 19th of September, and the speaker is Dr. Ephraim Ishaq, and I think I've gone and forgotten what he's going to speak on, so it's that's a treasure trove. But Ephraim Ishaq is a Syrian Orthodox scholar working in Austria, and he's done wonderful work on manuscripts and the early history of the Syriac Church. So thank you again, George, so much, and goodbye to everyone, and thank you for attending. So until September 19th.